John.
Hey, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good, good.
So, to introduce a little bit of the discussion we're going to have, um, Michael Sartori is somebody I consider a friend, even though I've only met him online. I've never met him in real life, and he speaks incredibly highly of you. You have a channel, Christianity on the Spectrum. As I understand, you wrote a book.
Well, I have several drafts of a book. I have not published anything.
Okay,
But yeah,
but you
I've
did.
just published a podcast about all my research.
Okay, so you've done a lot of research, like
Yeah, yeah.
thousands of interviews.
I think I've done the largest ever English language survey of autistic Christians and ex-Christians that has ever been done. So I've done a lot of data mining on social media. I've identified over 26,000 individual autistic Christians or ex-Christians and pulled their posts and read them. I've conducted over 500 formal long-form interviews with autistic Christians and ex-Christians, and I have just spoken to and had lots of conversations with well over 800 additional ones.
That is amazing. Just
Yep.
to briefly introduce Fountain of Comfort and what it is that we're doing here. Fountain of Comfort is a project of my channel. My channel, I focus on Hebrew Bible, and there's been a dialogue on my channel between Orthodox Christians and Orthodox Jews. And one thing we agreed on was that we can work together towards mental health in ways that we agree fit with our values, which unfortunately a lot of mental health is not guided spiritually like Orthodox Jews and Orthodox Christians would like. And so the hope is that eventually we will have enough people working, several students in mental health, including myself. I'm getting my master's of social work who are involved. Yosef is actually the president of our board of directors. Max is one of the clinical social workers who's involved. Um, and so I thought asking you about Christianity and autism spectrum disorder is perfect. I mean, it's right in line with the type of stuff we would like to talk about. Um, could you give us a little bit of understanding about why specifically Christianity on the spectrum, how people on the spectrum, um, Christianity, their Christianity is affected by, and um, why it being on the spectrum affects their Christianity?
Yeah, so there's a lot of questions there. So I'll try to hit them in that order, but let me know if I get off track. So I think it's probably best to just like back up a little bit and explain what I am and what I'm doing. I just want to make it really clear. I'm not a counselor. I'm not like a mental health professional or practitioner. I am a guy who does lots of research, and that's basically my only qualification to speak about this. So I started doing this podcast because basically I was raised in a very conservative evangelical household. It's actually Mennonite Brethren, but no one knows what Mennonite is, so I just tell them conservative evangelical because it's close enough. Like
But they're
every
Anabaptists.
they are, and like a good Anabaptist, I joined the army at age 18. It's
That's not very Anabaptist of you.
no, it's not. They're pacifists, but um, yeah. So I joined the army at age 18. Went to university, studied computer engineering, and I pretty quickly deconverted. Uh, Became an atheist. Joined the sort of new atheist movement. And then in my third year of university, I encountered a bunch of other autistic people at like a meetup event that was happening. So I'm from Canada. The Royal Military College is really close to another civilian university named Queen's in Kingston, Ontario, and so they had a meetup for autistic students, and so I met a whole bunch of other autistic students, and I noticed that there were a lot of us who had very similar backgrounds and very similar trajectories, but also came to our conclusions in very similar ways, and I thought, this is really weird. I wonder if this is a indicative of broader trends or just like a weird little anomaly in my microcosm.
Hmm.
So I started looking at peer-reviewed research and looking at what it said. And there was a few papers at the time, and the papers were suggesting that there were certain quirks of autistic neurology, like autistic mentalizing deficits was a really big one and a very frequently cited paper. So mentalizing is your ability to conceptualize the mental states and the thoughts of other people outside of your own head. And the paper was saying because autistic people typically struggle with this, they will typically struggle with the interpersonal relational parts of Christianity. And I read that and I thought, I'm not entirely sure that that is true. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm not sure if that really makes sense for me. And then I read the paper and I went, I don't think you guys understood either autism or Christianity particularly well. And
Oh
then
wow.
I looked for a whole bunch of other papers, and it kept on coming up where I just wasn't satisfied for the rationale they were giving.
Hmm.
And so there's a pretty well established trend, and I was able to also verify it with my own research that autistic people are less likely to be Christian than their non neurotypical counterparts, and less likely to be religious as a whole. Now, the levels of religiosity and the variations of religiosity depend on religion to religion and denomination to denomination. And autism isn't actually a super great predictor of whether or not you will be religious. The better predictors are other like socio demographic factors, like where you live and how religious your general place is.
Hmm.
Um, and so I wanted to figure out why, and so that's basically why I started my research project, because I just wanted to figure out why there was this negative correlation between autism and religiosity. Why is it that so many of us leave Christianity specifically? I started branching off into other religions, and then I very quickly realized I was wildly out of my depth. Right, so I I'm far more familiar with Judaism than I am with any of the other religions, but even then, I'm still like very surface level. And so with autistic people, it I found there are a lot of differences with Judaism than there is with Christianity.
I would think, especially between Orthodox versus not Orthodox,
Yes.
because yeah, the Orthodox lifestyle can. I mean, I can imagine it might be a lot easier as somebody on the spectrum um, to deal to live in a regimented life the way that Orthodox Jews do,
Yep.
um, and that might be very comforting, in fact.
Yep, and there are also a lot of other like with the different types of Jewish practices, right? There are different levels of doxastic commitment. So like different levels of how much do you really need to believe this? And with Judaism, there's also an ethnic component to it in the way that there is to some extent with some forms of Christianity. Like if you go into Orthodox Christians from particular parts of the world in North America, there's an ethnic component to it, but it's not the same as the ethnic component with Judaism. But I quickly realized that like I was just wildly out of my depth with every other religion, and I was like, I don't know enough to talk about these things. So I investigated Mormonism, but then people started talking to me about things within Mormonism, and I was like, I have literally never heard of this before. What are you talking about? And so with Christianity, I was very so Christianity is a very deep interest of mine. So even when I deconverted, I
Mhm.
called myself a Star Trek Christian
Okay.
in the sense that I was really interested in Christianity in the same way other people are interested in Star Trek. So
Mhm.
I like to learn the lore, and I like to understand what it was that's going on and like all the languages and stuff like that. I found very interesting, but like I didn't believe it was true. Is basically what it came down to. And so, yeah, I was interviewing Mormons, and I quickly realized like I don't know whether or not you're describing things accurately to me, right? Because I talk to autistic people, and they would say things like, "Well, I don't believe Christianity is true because Jesus was invented at the Council of Nicaea." And being a Christian or being a person who really understands Christianity, I can go, okay, well, you that's actually a false belief. Like that's not what Christians believe. That's not doctrinally sound. You have just misunderstood things. And I just realized I couldn't do that with Islam. I couldn't do that with Judaism. I couldn't do that with Mormonism or really anything else. And so I was just like, okay, I'm going to stick to Christianity. And then,
well, that I mean, you still have to define your terms, because I mean, obviously, some people would say Mormons are Christians. So I'm assuming you're including the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholics.
So I would say Nicene Christianity if you want to go with that. So
okay,
Christians who would adhere to a Nicene formula. So
you're including the
Protestants,
Copts.
Orthodox.
The Copts are not being kicked out. The Armenians are fine. Okay.
It's actually really funny that you mentioned the Copts. So like doing this research, there were a lot of quirks that I didn't expect to find and I didn't expect to see. And one of the questions that I would ask autistic people is I'd ask them, "Are you Orthodox?" Like in a lowercase o sense, Orthodox. Like, do you adhere to this? And a lot of times they would say things like, "No, I'm not Orthodox." And when you ask them why, a lot of them would say something like, "Well, I disagree with the Council of Chalcedon that said that the Miaphysite Christians were anathematized." And so like technically that is part of the Orthodox faith, and I don't really agree with that. And it's really funny. There's just this like enormous sympathy with the Miaphysite Christians.
Yeah, so Andrew is our resident Copt, and
okay,
he is a non-Chalcedonian Christian by creed. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, and that's actually one of the reasons why we've kind of limited it. I as much as I've wanted to include other forms of Christianity and really Judaism as well, like depending on what you're doing, you really have to. And so Fountain of Comfort kind of by default has become and it's hard enough to get to be guided by two religions, but yeah, to go further than that. Yeah,
I mean, it's hard enough to even stay within Christianity, right? Because
right.
like one of the questions I get a lot is, are autistic people less likely to be Christian than their non-autistic counterparts? And that question is actually extremely hard to answer, right? Because what is Christian? You have like charismatic Pentecostals, as low church as you possibly can, and then you have like Oriental Orthodox or like Russian Orthodox, and the overlap between them isn't particularly large in like some places they do, but yeah.
I realize I'm not being as clear as I should be. I was you saying Orthodox Jewish, capital O Orthodox, the denomination, which is about 10% of Jews. And by Orthodox Christians, I mean Eastern Orthodox specifically.
Okay. Yeah, I thought you meant like Orthodox. Yeah, that makes
I
sense
was not being clear. I realized when, but so Father Stephen DeYoung has been involved with my channel, and so this is we have Gage, who's on the board of directors, is actually Protestant himself, but the board of directors was specifically made up of Orthodox Jews and Eastern Orthodox Christians, and we've been staying specifically within that. So if you have anything specific to either one of those groups, I'm all ears. But I do want to hear like what what exactly like can you say about being on the spectrum and being a Christian that people can generalize to, let's say, 90% of people.
Yeah. So, would your audience be mostly familiar with what autism is? That might be a good thing to go into first.
That would be a great thing. I have many questions I would love to ask you, including people like there are people who are like, oh, isn't everybody on a spectrum? Like, and it's like,
Yeah.
no.
Nope. Nope. Not everyone is on the spectrum.
Right.
Um, yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So autism is basically, the best way to define it is a constellation of neurological traits. So it is basically just a way that your brain is structured, or a way that your brain is grouped to emphasize certain things and not emphasize others. So autistic people typically have difficulties with understanding relationships in the way that people typically understand relationships. It's not that we can't understand relationships, it's that we think about them very differently and we conceptualize them very differently. We're often like hyper systematizers. So, when you think about the sort of, it's not really an accurate spectrum, but conceptually the spectrum between relational thinking and systematic thinking, autistic people are typically much closer to the systematic side of things. So we're heavy systematizers. We have difficulties understanding social cues and nonverbal language and things like that. And we will often communicate differently. We will often think about things differently, think about language differently. A lot of us will struggle early on with language acquisition. And there are a whole bunch of things that come with these like different modes of communication. And because we often have such different modes of communication, it makes it hard for us to communicate with most other people.
And
Interestingly enough,
what I
go
want to
ahead.
point out is knowing this makes it a lot easier, and that's why we diagnose people with
Yeah.
autism spectrum disorder. Is then we can help them relate and be in harmony with their community a lot
Yeah.
better.
Yeah, and the sort of talking point, like everyone's autistic. It's like, well, there's no experience of autism that is completely unique to autistic people. Everyone struggles with socializing. Everyone has sensory issues. So autistic people often are very hypersensitive or hyposensitive. So, like to noise, sound, light, those type of things. You'll often see autistic people wearing like noise blocking headphones, and in places, just because we're extremely hypersensitive to those types of things. And it's like, yeah, everyone's sensitive to loud and unpleasant sounds, but what makes autism is the sort of frequency and intensity of those experiences, and the sort of critical mass is what I call it, of these traits. And so once you get above a certain level of critical mass, that is what makes autism a meaningful diagnostic category, is to basically say, yeah, you think sufficiently differently from other people, and you process the world and you process information about the world sufficiently differently from everyone, that this is actually a meaningful thing.
So
And
clinically, what we would say is that it's disruptive, and that's why in order for it to be a disorder,
yeah,
that this is something that manifests in your life enough that it's disruptive of your life, and we feel that clinically we need to identify this and help you adjust to it.
yeah. And yeah, so that's basically what autism is. And it often comes with other things, like we tend to get hyper specific interests, often called like special interests, where we get really focused on things. We tend to be very detail oriented. We tend to really care about fine details and whether or not things perfectly fit together, and often have like much lower tolerances for things that people typically have quite high tolerances for. And this can often lead to like other issues related to those types of things. But like one of the things I often say to people when they're skeptical of autism or skeptical of the diagnosis of autism is to basically say, look, we have enormous amounts of data about how it helps people when they're diagnosed. So if you have an adult who is not diagnosed with autism, and they go through their life not knowing they're autistic, and you measure their mental health before that, and then after they get diagnosed with autism or after they find out they're autistic, the the quality of their life and the quality of their mental health improves drastically, and it's like extremely easy to measure, because you basically, one of the experiences of being autistic is that you are like an alien, that you came from the wrong planet. So one of the earliest autism forums that popped up on the internet was called wrongplanet.net, because it was trying to capture this feeling that autistic people often have, that they're an alien. They can't relate to other people. They can't understand why people are saying things the way they are doing. Nothing really makes sense. A lot of these sort of social intuition that most people develop, we don't really develop that, or we don't develop it as quickly or as thoroughly as most people. And so we often feel like we're an alien species and we've just been implanted with the rest of humanity and we just look different. A lot of us will often describe experiencing life as if you've been thrown into the middle of a play and everyone else got a script and you didn't, and you just have to improv and figure your way out through it. And it is like, it sucks. I'll just be honest. It's not fun, and it's extremely taxing on your mental health. And so like figuring out you're autistic and just being like, "Oh, I'm not crazy. There is this thing, and there is this, like, I just think about things very differently." And it's not that, everyone is like this. It's very clear that most people aren't like this. And that's the reason why I'm having so many issues. And that also allows them to build effective strategies for coping, because once, it's that thing. If there's a Sun Tzu quote about it, if you know yourself but not your enemy, or if you know your enemy but not yourself, but if you know both, you actually will win. And so in this case, it's, knowing yourself and knowing that other people aren't like you and other people don't think like you is actually like incredibly important.
And it helps
Yeah.
when your loved ones, the people you're in relationship, they realize, oh,
Yeah.
yeah, this is something I need to be aware of. This is something I need to budget into this relationship. And
Yeah.
it helps people communicate.
Yep. A very common thing that happens is an autistic person will come to me and they'll mention that they're really struggling in their marriage. And I ask them, like, does your wife know you're autistic, or does your husband know you're autistic? And they're like, well, I haven't really thought about that yet. And I usually tell them, well, like, the first thing they need to do is like read the book, The Complete Guide to Asperger's Syndrome. They're typically people with Asperger's. So like on the autism has various levels to it. So there's level 1, which is low support needs, which is where I am and which is where the majority of the people that I focus on are. And then there's level 2, which is high support needs, and then 3, substantial support needs. So I typically deal with autism 1. It used to be called Asperger's or high functioning autism, but when the DSM-5 came in, they just put everything under the umbrella of autism spectrum disorder. And just,
You're
yeah.
speaking of
Yes.
this book, which is kind of sort of the Bible in
Yeah.
mental health. Yes.
Yeah, and so basically I just focus on autism 1, or what used to be Asperger's. So I was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome when I was a teenager, and yeah, like the massive improvement that it makes in your life to realize that you are autistic, because you can actually do something about it. And just realizing that your spouse is autistic and they might think about things differently, or realizing, oh, they're not doing this because they hate me. They're doing this because they just don't understand, or they're not picking up what I'm putting down. With my wife and I, before we got married, I made her read The Complete Guide to Asperger's Syndrome and do her homework and research so that she would know what she was getting into before we got married. And she was still fine with it after that. But yeah, that's basically what autism is.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next part of your question is basically, how does it interact with Christianity? And I will say, very complicatedly. So the autism and Christianity interaction is sort of a double-edged sword, right? So it can either make you very religious and very interested in religious practice and religious ritual, or it can push you very far away. One of the things that I often note in that the autism community is you typically don't get a lot of people in the middle ground, a lot of people, sitting in the undecided part. It's like a light switch. You're either completely on or you're completely off. And so that's a fairly big factor with autistic religious people. So you will either find the autistic person is very religious or they are not religious at all, and usually like in the new atheist, anti-theist side of things. So like I was in the new atheist community for probably like 10-ish years, and then I ended up reconverting to Christianity and then came back to Christianity, and now I'm pretty hard in the Anglo-Catholic side of the Anglican Church.
Okay.
But yeah, so a really interesting thing, and an interesting thing for your audience that you might be interested in specifically, is the phenomena that I documented within autistic people in the English speaking world that I call high church drift. So high church drift is this phenomena that I express it in terms of the older you get, if you are autistic and you stay within Christianity, the higher the percentage is that you will end up moving to a high church tradition. And so the high church traditions that you will typically move to if you're not already in one, the most common is Catholic, the next most common is Anglican, and then the third most common is Orthodox. And this is mostly because I'm surveying people in the English-speaking world, and people, the Orthodox are a minority in the English-speaking world. So you still, though, get a lot of, especially now, you're getting a lot of young autistic men converting to Orthodoxy, which is both a good thing and sometimes not a good thing, because a lot of the Orthodox parishes are not necessarily equipped to deal with or handle young autistic men and the various issues and eccentricities that come with them. And I mean, not just Orthodox parishes, I should say, most parishes just simply aren't prepared for the sort of level of intensity and the unique issues and challenges that they will face, and sort of pastoring and supporting them through those difficulties, and helping them socially integrate and helping them like mesh with their community and not piss people off, and make sure that they are properly socially integrating and things like that. So yeah, that's one place where I think it like relevantly intersects with this podcast, is you find a lot of autistic people will move from evangelicalism to or from a low church tradition to one of these high church traditions, and that's mostly because autistic people love ritual. Um, there's a really strong ritualistic component to the faith, but also a very strong sort of physical, tactile component to autistic spiritual expression. So when you look at how autistic people think through what it means to spiritually engage, they're often very focused on things like the Eucharist, or like physical signs of the faith that they can touch and they can taste and they can physically interact with. A lot of us struggle with the sort of abstract conceptualizing of a lot of these things. We struggle with the notion. So in Protestant Christianity, for example, you get this idea that you need to have a personal relationship with Jesus, right? And when you're autistic and you conceptualize personal relationships very differently from other people, like, what does that mean? When I can't talk to this person, I can't hear what they're saying. How do I have a relationship with someone that I can't see and speak with? Whereas in sort of more liturgical high church settings, the way that you interact with God is through the sacraments, right? The way God's manifestation on earth is through the sacraments. And so your interaction with the divine is mediated through these sorts of physical, tangible things that you can touch, smell, hear, and that type of thing. And especially in low church Protestantism, there tends to be a lot of emphasis on speaking, and like, you go to church to hear a sermon, whereas in a Orthodox church or a Catholic church or an Anglican church, you don't go to hear a sermon, you go to participate in the Eucharist. And so like these are a lot of things that drive them towards those specific traditions. One area of research that I really wanted to be able to do, but I'm just limited because of my language, is to do surveys of countries that are predominantly Orthodox, and then see what the difference is between religiosity and irreligiosity, and to see if it matches patterns in the English speaking world, because my intuition is it won't. My
Yeah.
intuition is that when you come to places where you have where the dominant religion is a sort of overt ritualistic embodied physical thing, that you're probably going to find higher rates of religiosity than you would in a sort of low church Jesus is my boyfriend feelings type of place,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I have to say, kind of part of what has for Fountain of Comfort, because I mean, for me, in terms of mental health, right? Unfortunately, there is this idea that some people may have, which is either religiosity is a form of mental illness, or it's something that interacts poorly with mental illness. And the fact is that from everything I've been able to see, and being, we talk a lot about the biopsychosocial spiritual, right? And all four of these components, the biological, the psychological, the social, and the spiritual, really do affect your health, right?
Yep.
And so part of that has been that really just clinically, I have to say, I think Reform and Conservative Judaism, unorthodox Judaism, that's not how they would call themselves, but how I would refer to them, which is 90% of Judaism, is very Protestant. Reform named itself after the Reformation. And yeah, I do think that really a lot of the Protestant characteristics, such as the very low church things and certain theological stuff, is just in terms of mental health. I just I think it's problematic, and that's why, Fountain of Comfort partially has also become, okay, not sure if you're committed to like low church, aniconic, asacramental, especially penal substitutionary atonement Christianity. Not sure the model that we're working with works for you. Whereas I do think the Orthodox Jewish and Eastern Orthodox Christian way of dealing with your spirituality helps people who have issues biologically, psychologically, or socially integrate better. And so, yeah, that's part of what Fountain of Comfort has become. So, yeah, you're not saying anything I disagree
Yeah.
with, but I might be just confirming my biases right there.
Yeah, so I would basically say that from my research, it's sort of a double-edged sword, right? Like there are so many different types of autistic people, and
Mhm.
some types of autistic people really vibe very well with a sort of high church liturgical um setting. One thing I will say though is when I started my research project, I predicted most autistic people would be like theologically liberal.
Mhm.
I predicted that most of them would probably be that, because a lot of autistic people leave the faith because of issues with doctrinal rigidity
Mhm.
and issues with like intellectual problems with the way that doctrine is articulated. So the primary way that autistic people engage with the faith is through intellectualization. Like we are heavy systematizers, heavy intellectualizers. And a lot of times when you have a very rigid doctrine, that you can come up to loggerheads with that, and it can be a double-edged sword. So it can make your mental health worse, but also there are for other people that it can make it better. And my position is basically agnostic and do whatever works. Like I'm not pro one or anti the other, but I just found that autistic people are far less likely to be theologically liberal, because there's a sort of sense with autistic people, it's like, well, either this really matters or it really doesn't. And going with churches where it's like, does it really matter? A lot of us kind of go, what's the point, and leave. And so you typically don't find us expressing liberal theologies. That being said, you'll find a few, like you'll find 10 to 15% ish, but the remaining, like the vast majority of us who are practicing religious, tend to skew theologically conservative. Politically conservative, not necessarily, but theologically conservative, yeah.
Yeah, and I have to say the communities which are more focused on orthopraxy than orthodoxy tend to be actually rather liberal. Like, they don't care as much if you are willing to assent to XYZ belief, just as long as you're able to live within the community.
Yeah, and so like when it comes to specifically autistic people involved in orthodoxy, like in Eastern Orthodox Christian practice, a lot of them find it very comforting, because doctrinally, while there is a lot of explicit doctrine set out, and there is a lot of explicit doctrine set out, there's also a lot of interpretive leeway within the tradition, where it's sort of like you have a left and a right of arc. And so long as you're playing within those boundaries, you're fine. But just don't go outside of them. And so I often describe autistic people as being on the fringes of orthodoxy. Mm-hmm. And so particularly the Eastern Orthodox autistics that I talk to, not even the Eastern Orthodox, just most autistic people who are really into church history and things like that, will typically be very interested in people like Gregory of Nyssa or the Cappadocians. I myself am a big Saint Basil enjoyer, but yeah. So you'll typically find us within the boundaries of orthodoxy, but sort of on those fringes where we know where the line is, and we make sure we don't step over the line, but we're like right on the inside there. And yeah, so you find a lot of that. Also on the Protestant side, you find a lot of autistics in like the hyper Calvinist world. I'm not sure if you've encountered many of those types.
I have certainly encountered hyper Calvinists, but I have to say, like, so my joke is, I try to kill two people every day: Martin Luther and John Calvin.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I only kill dead people. That's one of my rules.
Yeah.
I only kill dead people. I want to ask you about several things that are just for me in terms of autism. Have you noticed a gender divide, male and female?
Yeah, so this is one of those big debates within autism, because so humans are sexually dimorphic. We have men and we have women, and men and women typically express things differently. And then within those expressions, you get sub-expressions and things like that. And then you also get the added layer of socialization and how you're taught to act and things like that. And so in the early 90s, autism was thought to primarily be a boy thing. It was thought that maybe 1 in every 10, 1 in every 20 autistic people were girls, if that. Some ranges were like 1 in 50 were girls. But then as the 2000s hit, we started to realize, oh, wait, little girls aren't little boys. And they behave very differently, and they have different sets of social expectations placed on them, and they're taught to behave very differently. What if we're missing something? What if girls are autistic, but the autism plus female socialization, or some combination of nature and nurture, whatever you want to say, what if that changes the expression of autism? And so we went from basically no girls are autistic to all of a sudden maybe 1 in 3 girls is autistic, and now maybe one in every, or there's a 2-to-1 ratio, and now a lot of us are like, maybe it's like a 1.2-to-1 ratio. Like in my experience, I'm pretty sure we're going to get to like a, it probably won't be a direct 1-to-1, like nothing is ever 1-to-1
Yeah.
ratio, but it's probably going to be similar to that. And basically autistic women have just been wildly underdiagnosed because we were looking for male expressions of autism in women and not finding it, or finding it very rarely.
Yeah, this is
And
I
yeah,
mean, I have to say, like, what kills me about this is it seems very, very obvious to me that all the criteria needs to be gendered. Like, I'm
yeah,
sorry. Like, we are dimorphic as a species, and there is a theological commitment to men and women must be mentally the same, which I find actually offensive and silly.
yeah. And so basically one of the reasons that like autism rates have shot up over the years is basically because we realize girls can also be autistic, right? And so when before you thought 50% of the population or like 52% of the population wasn't autistic, and now you're like, oh wait, actually they can be autistic, it's just autism looks different in women. Like that's going to shoot your rates up by like 100%, right?
Right.
Because all of a sudden you're like, oh yeah, half the population does express this. They just express it in ways that look very different from boys. Like, right? You should look at how men act and the social expectations placed on men, and then why expect those exact same things with women?
Yeah.
Doesn't
Yeah.
make much sense.
No,
And
100%.
yeah,
Now, you're bringing up another thing, which I think, especially in the Christian environment, is important to talk about because, and I do want to ask you kind of about both of these things. There are certain Christian denominations which, I mean, some of them, Calvinists will say there's no such thing as a psychological disorder. These things don't exist. They're only spiritual maladies. And to the where there are people who say the rates of autism is going up, whereas other people say no, we're just diagnosing it a lot more than we used to. So yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think there are clearly just like brain differences. Like I don't know, you know how you have really tall people and really short people. Like you have different builds, you have different hair colors, you have different literally everything. Why wouldn't you have different brains? Like why would there only be one type of brain, or only be one type of brain type? And so it just seems obvious to me that there's going to be some percentage of the population that's just going to have a different brain type. And like that's basically all autism is, right? It's just a different type of brain that functions and thinks differently than everyone else. And I mean, so one of the best ways to predict whether or not a child will be autistic is looking at their parents and seeing if they're autistic. And one thing that you see a lot with questions about diagnostic criteria and things like that is diagnostic criteria has significantly expanded over the years. And so what we used to not consider autism is now autism. And screening has also significantly improved. So one very, very common thing that I see from a lot of my research is a parent will come to me with an autistic child and be like, I have this autistic child. I don't know how to support them. I'm losing my mind. Can you help me? And I talk to them for a bit and I'm like, have you considered that you might also be autistic? And they hadn't. And then they start looking through like an adult autism screener and they go, oh, that was me. This is me. Exactly. Or another common thing that you'll see is a child will get diagnosed with autism. And then the parent will go, that's not autism. I was exactly like that when I was a kid. So, like, my dad did that with me. My dad was like, you're not autistic. You're just exactly like I was. Turns out we're both autistic. It's just that back in like the 1970s, they didn't have screening criteria that would have caught him or labeled him as anything. And I mean, it's basically the easiest way to explain the rise in autism is we've just got better at finding it. We more people know that you should be finding it, more people know to look for it. Like, in if you would have asked your average doctor in the 2000s what is autism, most of them wouldn't be able to give you a definition. Most of them wouldn't be able to tell you. If you asked your average teacher or like school counselor or social worker what autism was in the 2000s, most would be able to tell you what like autism 3 was, right? Like they would look for severe mental handicaps or like severe signs, but wouldn't be able to identify Asperger's if it hit them in the face. And so one of the easiest ways to think about like why there has been so much of an increase in autism is basically like we just got better at looking for it. Like if before we knew what cancer really was, cancer rates would have probably been pretty low, but they wouldn't have actually been low. We just wouldn't have known it was cancer. The person would just die, right? But now we know that when we like do an MRI, and so like not only do you now know it's cancer, but we also have tools to better look for it. And then we have processes specifically designed to actually look for it and differentiate it from other things. And so like, the difference between autism and ADHD, for example, or the difference between autism and bipolar personality disorder or borderline personality disorder or something like that. Just like figuring out what all these differences are. I mean, like to me, just doing this research, it's very clear that there's something, right? If you don't want to call it autism, I don't really care. But there is something here that is common between this very large subset of people. What are we going to call it? Sometimes people are like, oh, we shouldn't call it autism. It's like, okay, well, we need some name for it. We've already got autism, so why not just use that one? Because like a lot of us are struggling, and a lot of us are really struggling, and learning what it is, just like naming it, helps an enormous amount in dealing with these things.
I mean, I'm going to kind of steel man the idea that pathologizing, right? So if all these people were not being diagnosed and they were living their lives, like you said, your father, he didn't know he was autistic, and here he was, an adult, a functioning adult, and nobody had said anything. And there becomes a real question: why, at the very least, why are you even just calling it a disorder, right? And
I mean,
yeah.
So the answer to that is because my dad really struggled and really struggles with a lot of stuff, and really struggles with a lot of stuff that could be easily identified and shown to him and be like, look, we have this descriptive model that can predict your behavior and we know you're missing these things. And like at the end of the day, if autistic people weren't struggling, I'd say who cares, right? Like this is another question like brown hair or like eye color, right? Like if autistic people didn't have any issues or didn't have any sort of like social integration problems, if they didn't have like really high rates of depression, really high rates of suicidal ideation, like intense despair at the idea of never being able to socially integrate and not having these intense feelings of isolation and social confusion. Like if those things weren't a factor, I'd say who cares what we call it? Like let's not pathologize it. But at the end of the day, like we're struggling. Like we are having a lot of problems, just to put it mildly. So one anecdote that I tell is I was looking to hire a research assistant to help me just go through the masses of data that I had collected for when I was planning on writing a book and publishing it. And I had to screen them beforehand and say, are you okay with reading suicide notes? And they were like, what? Like, oh, you haven't dealt with the autism community, have you? Because like it's bad. Like it's extremely brutal and harrowing. And like my background is intelligence and digital forensics. So before I did this, I was what most people would recognize as a military intelligence officer. I wasn't military intelligence, I was SIGINT, but most people don't know what that means. So computer intelligence.
NSA.
No, so in that frame, right? So with that type of thing. And so I saw a lot of very heinous stuff. And I also did digital forensics work and digital forensics investigation, and have worked on like sexual assault forensic investigations and sexual exploitation forensic investigation, human trafficking, that type of thing. And so I've seen some of the worst stuff that humanity has to offer. So I'm sort of hardened to all of this. And it doesn't really affect me the same way it affects other people. But like it's rough. I'll tell you, even as someone who's sort of seen the worst that humanity has to offer, working within the autism community gets pretty brutal. You see a lot of desperation, a lot of difficulty. And yeah, I basically say that's why we need to name it, because there's a lot of issues, and once you name the issues, they get better, right? And here's the thing, like if autism was something that required intense medical intervention, like if you got autism and that made you go on a whole bunch of medication that had wild side effects or had serious and significant effects, I would say like, okay, like let's be cautious about this. Let's take a very informed clinical approach to this, but it doesn't, right? There is no medical intervention for autism. The only intervention is learning about yourself and learning how to cope with the various differences that you have with other people. And so it's all just like personality work, like just working on yourself, learning about other people, and learning how to better relate to other people now that you know that your brain works differently than others. And so at the end of the day, pathologizing it doesn't actually do anything bad, and it has significantly positive effects. And like, there, especially online, there's a lot of like self-diagnosis of autism and stuff like that. And again, if it required medical intervention, I would probably be a lot stricter on it, but it doesn't. And I know for a fact people get self-diagnosis wrong. Like I study this all the time. I'm fairly capable of recognizing incorrect self-diagnosis. But at the same time, most people that I see self-diagnosing with autism, especially if they're over the age of 25, are usually pretty accurate. Like it's has a very low false positive rate for people above the age of 25. I'll say once you go below the age of 25, especially once you go into like teenagers who are still working through issues of like identity formation and other people who have lots of co-occurring mental health conditions. So, if you have depression, schizophrenia, other things going on, your chances of incorrectly diagnosing yourself with autism go up. But if you're not in that category, self-diagnosis is for the most part pretty accurate. And so, like I said, the intervention is just learning about yourself and then working on yourself and improving the way that you think about people and understanding them. So I really don't see a harm in doing it.
Well, I mean, I have to say, I think misdiagnosing things, including diagnosing yourself with a disorder that you don't have, can definitely, even if it weren't for the medical intervention,
I would not recommend it for sure.
Yeah. It and this is part of what we're trying to do here is have more information and more credible information, because unfortunately the fact is that a lot of our experts will say things which we know is completely wrong.
Yeah, that does happen a lot, especially with autism.
And when an authority tells you something you know is wrong, you stop believing them. And that leads to people then going, well, why is my diagnosis any worse than the expert's diagnosis? But you were going to give an example.
Yeah, I was going to say, especially like there's a lot of really bad autism information pretty much wherever you go on the internet, and a lot of people get really wrong ideas about it.
Mm-hmm.
One of the tests that I do to tell if someone has accurately diagnosed themselves with autism is to basically say, what is autism? Like, just tell me what you think autism is and why you have it. It's a question I pretty much ask everyone, just because it's useful information to get when you're trying to survey a population. But there is just a lot of genuinely bad information on TikTok and on Twitter and on various other social media platforms about what autism is and what autism isn't. And there is a lot of like pathologizing very normal behaviors. So they're like, if you read a lot of books, you might be autistic. And it's like, nope, that's not true. Lots of people read lots of books and they aren't autistic. Like, that's not what you should be doing. Yeah.
John asked the question: Is there a link between autism and OCD?
So, is there a link as in a causative link? We are not sure. Is there a link as in a correlation, as in if you are autistic, are you more likely to be OCD? Yes, or vice versa. So there are lots of these types of things. So OCD is a whole different thing from autism, but a lot of autism symptoms and OCD symptoms overlap, and a lot of people who have autism also have OCD, but it's I think it's, so don't quote me on this, it's something around 18% co-occurring between them, which is much higher than it is in the average population.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, but what it is and why there is that co-occurring overlap is very difficult to understand, right?
Yeah.
Because like, we actually don't know why people are autistic. When you look at it, there's a very strong genetic component. So there are a few correlating factors. So age of the parent
Mm-hmm.
and if the parent is autistic are some of the two best ways that we can figure out whether someone will be autistic. So if you have an older mother or an older father, or older both mother and father, and you have a genetic history of autism, you're more likely to be it. But other than that, like, we have not found an autism gene. We have not found an autism brain structure that is unique to autistic people. There's a lot of fMRI stuff with autism. I have willingly guinea pigged myself for many of these tests when I was in university and when I was in my early 20s. I was right near a research hospital, and so I signed up for all the tests just because I thought it would be fun. And they can recognize common brain structures in autistic people, but not every autistic person has those things. Not every autistic brain lights up in the same way. Sometimes they do, sometimes you have clusters. Within my own autism research, I have like a way of categorizing autistic Christians and where they fall, and I have like 16 different subcategories of them. So,
Oh wow,
like,
that
yeah,
sounds really interesting.
yeah. So there's a lot of stuff going on, and so there's links between autism and ADHD. Why is there a link? Not sure, but we just know that if you're autistic, you're also likely to have ADHD.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
so
so I have to say, mental health disorders in general, right? That they were the various categories have been created because of clinical focus, right?
Yeah.
The diagnosis is there in order for us to be able to say, okay, this is a problem this person has, right? Regardless of why they may have it. And these are possible things that can help them either live with it or not have the symptoms as much, or hopefully get rid of it. But it's not an etiology. It doesn't tell you why that person has it.
Yeah.
And like you're talking about, within it, there can be various, different patterns. And so, yeah, I mean, really, in the mental health field, people who diagnose ASD, autism spectrum disorder, like, that is their emphasis. That's what they work on. Yeah.
Yeah. And I pretty so on back on the topic of self-diagnosis, I don't want to give the wrong opinion. I pretty much tell everyone it's better to actually get diagnosed by a professional who knows what they're doing than to self-diagnose. Self-diagnosis, like, I don't know, it's fine. For my research, I talk to a lot of self-diagnosed autistic people who it's like, okay, if you're not autistic, I don't know who is, type of thing. But at the end of the day, like, talk to a professional who knows what they're doing before you make any like strong pronouncements or major life decisions. Especially if you're in a place where it's accessible. Obviously, if it's not accessible or you can't afford it or whatever, don't like and break your bank try to get a diagnostic.
It shouldn't be that expensive to
Yeah,
get a diagnosis, honestly, especially if you're in the United States. It really shouldn't be that hard
yeah.
to
Canada, it's free, so
yeah,
you can.
yeah.
I'm in Canada, and
Okay.
so if you're in Canada, I just say yeah, like you'll go on a waiting list, and the waiting list's a few years, but you know,
Oh, okay. Yeah,
just get on that, and you're fine.
it shouldn't be that hard in the United States. What
Yeah,
I will say is, especially for parents and for people under 25, like you said,
yeah,
it becomes especially important, I think, to find a credible and good
yeah,
person who can. Uh, the problem is, and this is part of the reason we've created Fountain of Comfort, is like when people ask me, who do you recommend? I don't have anybody to recommend as somebody that I feel comfortable with.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and so one other thing I'll mention on the topic of diagnosis is when you look at autistic people and how well they thrive, one of the best indicators of them thriving is early diagnosis. So the earlier you get diagnosed, the earlier you can do interventions and the earlier you can get help and recognize these things, the better your outcomes are going to be. And so a lot of people who you recognize the little boy's autistic when they're 4, the chances that you're going to have a lot more success and they're going to thrive a lot better go up significantly if you can get it at that early stage and like do proper interventions and help them build healthy and good coping mechanisms and just to help them understand and contextualize their experience. um, and it can just save a lot of hassle for later in life. So yeah, getting early diagnosis, especially if it's available to you, is something that I would, from a qualified professional,
yeah, yeah.
is something that
Um,
I'd recommend.
Apparently, you did an episode on medical assistance in dying.
I did, yeah. Yeah, I'm not a fan at all, to say the least. So,
Yeah,
um,
yeah. I,
yeah,
I I would agree with you, and organizationally, Fountain of Comfort. I have to say, I don't think there's any Eastern Orthodox priest, and I know there are zero Orthodox rabbis who approve of medical assistance in dying.
yeah. So I'm in the Anglican Church of Canada, and unfortunately, some of our leaders are not great on this issue. I am at a church specifically because this church is very against MAID, and it's a very important issue for the autism community specifically because in Canada they're looking to expand um, the eligibility for MAID. So it used to be only in cases of near foreseeable death, and even on then there are lots of arguments to be made against it. But like we won't go into those right now because they're not necessarily autism related. But Canada has expanded its diagnostic or its eligibility criteria for MAID, and it has expanded it to include non-terminal mental health conditions, and it has been approved in cases for a person on the basis that they're autistic. And so there was a famous case of a woman who wanted to get MAID. You need to get 2 doctors to approve it. She went to 7 doctors, 5 of them said no, 2 of them said yes. So she got the approval, and her parents were taking her to court to try to get her to stop and not get MAID. And yeah, and so that was like one case, and the only criteria for her was autism, and there was one other mental health condition that I forget. But you see stuff like that, and then you think, okay, well, what is it about autism specifically that makes your life bad? And it is nothing to do with autism. It has to do with the way that you integrate into society. You know, you have no community, you feel desperate, you feel alone, you don't feel mentally well, you feel like you can't integrate with people, you don't understand them, you can't relate to them. These are not issues that are solved with MAID, right? These are issues that are solved by robust community support and by caring about people in a very different way than we typically do in our very atomized individualistic society. And so like we need to address those things. Or, you know, a lot of autistic people struggle with being able to have employment or being able to hold down a steady job. Like I'm lucky. I'm a computer engineer. I work in cybersecurity. I'm well employed, and I am in a field that is populated with huge numbers of autistics. And so everyone knows what autism is. Everyone knows how to deal with autistic people. It's like expected, right? If you're an advanced forensic technical expert, like you're gonna be a little on the spectrum. And so I have a great life because I ended up being in one of these positions where being autistic doesn't hurt me, but there are a lot of autistic people who are not so lucky. And I had a friend who was considering MAID, who was autistic, and he was like, I'm actually going to go through with this, and I convinced him to give it 6 months. It's just like, let's just wait 6 months. And things started turning around for him. Like, just the stars aligned, things started to get moving, and he went, you know what, I'm no longer considering this. And it's like, great, that is good. However, the fact that you were even considering it in the first place, the fact that we were at this point, is not great. And when you look at like so autism has very high rates of suicidal ideation, it has very high rates of attempted suicide when you compare it to the regular population. And so then you add in this sort of like medicalized, sanitized, quick, clean way of doing it where you don't have to do anything and it's all a doctor doing it. It just adds in extra components that are not good for autistic people. And like I don't know any autistic people, like regardless of their political affiliation, who are in support of MAID, who are also Christian. Like for the autistic Christians that I've been able to survey, it's like everyone across the board is anti-MAID. And the only times you'll get exceptions are people who are like, okay, well, maybe in the cases of near foreseeable death, but even then they'll still say it's still bad.
Uh,
But like, yeah,
I have one good thing to say about MAID. It's a great hotline for suicide counselors to answer, and that's about it.
yep, yep. I don't have much good to say about it, and particularly when MAID legislation was introduced, a lot of people who were very concerned about disability and disability rights and how this would be affected were told, this is not a slippery slope, you're overreacting. And then lo and behold, it in fact was, and MAID has now been expanded. And you know, that case I talked about where the woman was being sued by her parents so she wouldn't take MAID, that case went public. We knew about it. How many do we not know about? You know, and then there are also like famous cases of in Canada of one woman who is a disabled veteran, and she called because she needed a new stair lift because she was a disabled veteran, and they said, have you considered MAID? You know,
Oh my
it's just
god!
like absurd situations like that where or people who are struggling with housing, or like social housing is really bad for them, or they're in an apartment building in a low income neighborhood because they're disabled and they can't work and they have difficulties with that. And it's not great for them. You know, it's dangerous. There are bad neighbors. Their neighbors are smoking and they have like smell sensitivity, and they're like, I'd rather die than live here. And so
Mm,
it's like, this is not something that we should be even entertaining as a possibility, right? Like, the solution here is not to let these people kill themselves or to facilitate killing themselves. It is to help these people and help them in their struggles, basically.
yeah. Are you aware of Eamon and Catherine Wilson?
Not off the top of my head, no.
Okay, so the reason they came up is they are, I believe they are Anglican. I'm not sure. They are definitely Canadian, and they're both mental health practitioners in our little
Yeah.
sphere here. And so I was wondering, and Catherine has been particularly worried about Maid. She's the one who really brought it to my attention, and yeah, yeah. I guess we should talk about. I don't know if you've done episodes on gender dysphoria and autism.
I did 3 episodes on various topics related to autism, autistic perceptions of gender, autistic perceptions about sexuality, all these types of things. Um, yeah, so there is a lot of gender dysphoria in the autistic community, to put it lightly. A lot of trans people, a lot of non-binary people. Um, yeah, there is a lot.
I,
Why are there a lot is a completely different question. And like, there are all sorts of complications when it comes to questions of gender and questions of sexuality, especially when you add in autism. So when you add in autistic people, and our responses to socialization, our responses to social mimicry, our responses to how we view and see our own bodies, these types of things get very complicated, to put it lightly.
yeah.
So like, I had gender dysphoria as a teen. It went away.
Mhm.
um it morphed into an eating disorder. So like, I struggle with an eating disorder and body dysmorphia now. I used to struggle with gender dysphoria as well. That went away when I was like 19. I
Yeah.
don't know why it went away. It just did. And
Well,
that's
yeah.
fairly common for autistic people to say, like, that they had gender dysphoria or they went through a period of gender dysphoria. I thought that was just a weird me thing, right?
How
Like,
old are
I
you?
didn't. I'm in my 30s, like early
Okay.
30s.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, so the CAS report in Great Britain discussed this, and part of the problem I've been having with gender dysphoria as it's being treated is too many people are not doing differential diagnoses, right? So you may be having symptoms, and it's a good professional real has to understand, hey, this may be due to various causes, and um yeah, unfortunately too many people haven't been doing differential diagnoses, which really kills me.
yeah, and there are all sorts of different complications, and there are all sorts of differences between like gender dysphoria and how it manifests in men and how it manifests in women, and all those types of things. So like, I I encounter a lot of trans people in my research. A lot of them are my friends. I talk to them a lot about this stuff. I often joke that everything I learned about trans issues I've learned against my will, but I've learned an enormous amount of them. Like, I've actually gone through the CAS report.
Okay.
So I have read very broadly. So I have read all the pro trans side. So like, I have gone through Julia Serrano. I have gone through every pro trans and every major like thing they publish, and also I've gone through the other side. So I have gone through the CAS report. I have gone through, Jesse Singal's reporting
Hmm.
on gender dysphoria. I've gone through the sort of Tavistock,
Right.
I don't know what you call it, meltdown
Yeah.
explosion,
Yeah.
whatever happened there. And I've talked to a lot of detransitioners and desisters as well. And there's just a lot going on, basically,
Yeah.
with that. And there you know, I think there is like just a lot of it, and I don't think anyone knows why in particular. I think it's probably a combination of a whole bunch of things that happen with autism. I have found a lot more autistic men deal with gender dysphoria or deal with gender dysphoria and seek out transition than autistic women. Autistic women will have gender dysphoria as well, but it will typically be differently expressed than it is in autistic men. And autistic trans women have various different thoughts about gender dysphoria and how it affects them, and autistic men have various different, like trans men have different experiences and thoughts about what it is, and there's just a lot going on there. So
Yeah, Mark mentioned a book by Simon Baron Cohen. I have no idea what he's talking about.
yeah, so Simon Baron Cohen is an autism researcher. I believe he's out of Cambridge or Oxford. I can't, one of the major British universities. It's either Cambridge or Oxford. And he has a lot of various different ideas of autism. One of them is autism as an extreme of the male brain. And so it's this idea that, how you have gendered brains basically, or like, and it's not like you have a pink brain and you have a blue brain. You have a sort of like bimodal distribution of cognitive traits where there's overlap and things like that, like a double camel hump type of distribution.
The cast review was explaining that
Yes.
bimodal distribution, and it was like, why don't we have this is just basic science.
Yeah. Yeah. And so basically, Simon Baron Cohen's idea was that autism is an expression of the sort of extreme of the male brain and an extreme hyper systematizing. And he also did a lot of like theorizing about autism being mentalizing deficits. So mentalizing, or theory of mind. So theory of mind is like your ability to conceptualize the thoughts and mental states of other people. And his idea was that autism is a sort of significant lack of theory of mind, and that is what explains a lot of it. His research has come under a lot more scrutiny since 2010, basically, and people are like, is the extreme of the male brain really a good way to describe it? Maybe like before we knew that there were so many autistic women, maybe it's a good way of explaining autistic boys,
right?
But is this a good way of describing all autistic people? Because autistic women, are they the extreme of the female male brain? Like what does that mean? Or are they just more on the male side of that sort of bimodal distribution? Or how does that even work? And like the conceptual model for describing autism often just isn't particularly useful when you're trying to describe like different genders and things like that. And then mentalizing deficits is one of the difficult ones to also deal with, because mentalizing is, autistic people can mentalize. So autistic people can make predictions about the mental states of other people. It's often just a basic logic game, right? Like if you can logically deduce things, you can mentalize, right? Because you could just think, if I was this person, what would I be seeing? And you can just, so long as you have that conceptual ability, and a lot of autistic people do. There is, however, controversy, or not really controversy, but discussion about higher order theory of mind, or like triadic joint attention. So triadic joint attention is sort of the experience of experiencing something with another person, and that experience of that object with a second person influences your perception of that object in the way that it wouldn't influence it if that other person wasn't there. And so autistic people do tend to struggle with those types of things, or don't seem to be as affected by it. My basic intuition on all of this, and from talking to so many autistic people, is that mentalizing is basically a spectrum of ability, and autistic people tend to probably be less likely. But even then, autistic people are really good at predicting other autistic people's mental states. So there's this other thing, it's called the double empathy problem. And so autistic people are often like considered to be less empathetic, or less understanding of other people, or double empathy in like terms of cognitive empathy, like your ability to put yourself in another person's shoes. And so autistic people are often seen as having empathy deficits because we're really bad at figuring out what's going on in other people's minds. But we're really good at figuring out what's going on in other autistic people's minds. And so it's like, is this actually an empathy deficit? Because we're really good at doing it with other autistic people. And then we also find out that non-autistic people are really bad at doing it with autistic people. And so it's like, okay, is this an autism thing, or is this just people with different brain types understand each other better when they have a similar brain type? So like, is this really mentalizing deficits going on here? Or are we just calling autism a mentalizing deficit because we're like 1% of the population? And so if you're a small minority of the population and you have the 1% has difficulty reading the 99%, and the 99% has difficulty reading the 1%, it's only considered a deficit for the 1%, when really it's technically a deficit for both sides, isn't it? But we only categorize it as a deficit for one side because practically it only really matters for that 1%.
Yeah, what you're describing is, I mean, just generally a problem with etiology, and the way I like to describe it is, look, if you're left-handed in a right-handed world, you're going to have trouble. And if you're right-handed in a left-handed world, you're going to have trouble. And so if a vast majority of people are right-handed, guess what? The desks are going to be right-handed, and the writing is going to be, and all the scissors are going to be right-handed scissors, right? And so recognizing, hey, maybe we need some left-handed scissors doesn't change what the norm is, but it can help us understand each other a lot better. Yeah.
And would it be accurate to say like left-handed people have right-handed deficits? Because it's like, maybe, but you would also have to describe the right-handed people as having left-handed deficits. Anyway, this is like a whole discussion with Simon Baron-Cohen's work, and the various things with it. Generally speaking, I find a lot of his stuff more useful for describing autistic boys than I do autistic girls. But those are my general thoughts on Simon Baron-Cohen.
Okay. And another thing that I was actually looking at recently was, so people with ASD tend to be more likely also to have a personality disorder. I have to say, if you are considering diagnosing yourself with narcissistic personality disorder, you definitely don't have it. And if you're trying to diagnose someone else with a narcissistic personality disorder, you probably are the one who has it.
I've never thought about that. That is quite funny.
So this is the problem with I mean, personality disorders. I mean, one of my professors just was like, don't even bother telling people they have personality disorders, because somebody who has a personality disorder will not believe you. Generally, that's definitely true with narcissistic personality disorder. But yeah, personality disorders, they're their own special thing. I don't know if you've looked into it, if you have anything you want to say about it.
I have looked into it and I've thought a lot about it, mostly because it is something that comes up a lot with the autism stuff. But like, I just find the whole area very difficult to parse, and given that it's not my field of specialty, I tend not to comment on it beyond like, autistic people do tend to have more personality disorders. But is that because like the autistic brain is more susceptible to these types of things? Is this when you're autistic, you grow up in a world that's not like you, and so because of that you develop in a certain way? I really don't know. I just know that there is a large overlap, and I've read a lot of literature about it, and it kind of goes both ways, and it depends on who you ask. I've talked to a lot of professors about this type of thing. Like, I've developed a lot of relationships with various various people in psychiatry and psychology and in various circles, and I asked them about it, and you ask two people, you get three different answers type of thing. And
Mhm.
so it's one of those fields that I find very difficult to parse personally. And so I'm like, okay, I just know that this occurs a lot, and it's more difficult to deal with people if they have a diagnosed personality disorder, but I don't really know what to do with it beyond that. And so I try to mostly just stick to autism.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, do you have, I mean, do you think it's possible that there will be, or do you have hopes of there being medical treatments? I mean, I'm thinking even for something as hypersensitivity or something like that, just dulling of the senses, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be cool.
Mhm.
I'm not particularly optimistic about it, and I think, especially for autism, a lot of the a lot of the things that make me very nervous about interventions is a lot of interventions are aimed at finding autism in utero so that you can get a selected abortion,
Yeah.
and that makes me nervous personally. And I'm so like, do I want to support that research? No, not really. That's I do not think that is a good and moral thing to do. Um, However, like sensory issues and things like that. I mean, a lot of the interventions for autism are social interventions, right? They're learning how to better teach autistic people how to deal with the various differences that they have. And so in terms of like interventions, I would mostly be hoping for therapeutic interventions that and just improvements in making it better, teaching autistic people how to cope with these things better and giving them better strategies for interacting with the world. And not only that, but just helping other people understand autism goes an enormous way, right? Like once a parent understands their child's autism, it gets a lot easier to cope with and a lot easier to deal with. And
Hmm.
so in terms of intervention, that's mostly where I would focus on for those types of things. And that's where I think you're going to have the most success. And when it comes to medical intervention, like I said, I get quite squeamish around it, mostly because it seems like the vast majority of intervention now is focused on in utero detection. Um, so that you can go so like similar to like Down syndrome in utero detection for selected abortion.
Yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, genetic etiology, like being able to genetically screen, and I have to say, like when you maximize for anything in a gene pool, guess what? That's going to affect things, and
Yep.
yeah, the ethical implications there is just crazy. I wanted to ask you just in terms of Christians who want to um, you know be sensitive to the fact that there may be autistic people in their congregation, who want to be welcoming, etc. um, is there anything you would recommend as general? Hey, this is a small thing you can do that can help people be more comfortable in your church.
Yep. So the biggest most effective, like most bang for your buck that you'll get is just education, learning what autism is and having other people learn what it is so you can like just better understand it. So, I mean, shameless plug for my podcast, where I go to explain this stuff. But in general, just basic education goes a really long way. After that, I would say keep things predictable. And if you're going to change things, let people know. And if you're going to change things up, or if you're going to do things differently, let them know in advance. Other things, just have clear, concise directions that tell you exactly what's going to happen. So a lot of autistic people have told me like, I want to go to church, but like the it's difficult because I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if people are going to look at me. I don't know if they're going to judge me. I don't know how it's going to work. Like, what if I do something wrong? Am I going to get punished for it? That type of thing. And so just clearly laying out like, this is what's expected of you. This is how we expect you to act. This is what we expect you to do. And just giving, I often say, more thorough than you probably think you need to instructions for what's expected of people usually helps us a lot. So doing those basic things, and then just like talking to the autistic person in your congregation if they're there, and just being like, what can we do to help you? Because like I said, some autistic people will be extremely sensitive to smell and some won't be. And so for some autistic people, like, they wear a mask in church because they have smell sensitivity and they want to be there, but there's a lot of incense. And so, just letting people know that, like, this guy's wearing a mask, just leave him alone. It's just a sensory issue. Don't worry about it, type of thing. But yeah, those are kind of the big things. Just education, I often say, is probably the best thing you can do, because that gives you the broadest range of tools to effectively assess the situation. But then, like, especially since your audience is mostly Orthodox, I would say probably don't have to worry too much about church changes and things like that.
Yeah, liturgy.
Yeah, that's not really something you guys do great or do a lot of. Yeah, a lot of autistic people don't want you to change the service for them. They don't want you to change things for them. They just want you to be understanding. Yeah, and like, again, not pandering.
Don't pander.
Not pandering is also good. Just like treat them like a human. Treat them like a person with like you would other people. That's another big thing. I hate it when people pander to me, or when people, especially when I go to like more liberal progressive churches, they treat me like I'm a sort of hurt puppy. I don't like that at all. And I often don't like attention at all. So yeah, but just the easiest thing to do is just learn about it. Learn about these sort of quirks and eccentricities. Especially I deal a lot with young autistic men, and sometimes I have to like reel them back because they have a tendency to go quite extreme and quite hard. You tell them these are the rules and they really go for it. And sometimes the pastoral direction that would be good for other people isn't necessarily good for autistic people, because we tend to take things extremely literally and very seriously. And so sometimes for autistic people, you have to do more of like reining them in than trying to motivate them to go forward and do stuff. So just keeping in mind those things, like, as well, is probably pretty important.
Yeah. Have you found there are particular doctrines or things that they're described in such a way that autistic people are more prone to really misunderstand?
Yeah, there are quite a few things. So autistic people often really struggle with religious scrupulosity, like having sort of like, say, don't think about this, or don't participate in this, and then they do something slightly like that, and then because they do it, they get sort of they get caught in negative feedback loops where they're sort of like, I did the bad thing, I can't do the bad thing. and it sort of spirals out of control there. So usually I tell pastors and priests, emphasizing the seriousness of sin is very good. For autistic people, also emphasize the grace aspect as well, especially if they struggle with religious scrupulosity, which is extremely common for autistic people. So those types of things. Doctrinally, autistic people have all sorts of weird quirks, I will say, and you can't really predict them. When it comes to doctrine, you really never know what you're going to get. So a lot of autistic people will just, like, right off the bat be like, no, I will not accept penal substitutionary atonement or anything related to that. So don't come at me with this.
I approve.
Yeah. and so you'll get that. But others will be like, I love penal substitutionary atonement, and without it, you can't have the gospel. so, when it comes to that, there are all sorts of things. But I think
Yeah.
the biggest one that you should watch out for is sort of religious scrupulosity, and a sort of like, autistic people have a tendency to hardline and take things extremely seriously. So sometimes as a priest, you're talking to people who don't who understand things in moderation, and who sort of will contextualize what you say. Often autistic people may not contextualize what you say, and like you tell them, you know, it's good to fast. They'll be like, they'll hear that as an I should always be fasting type
Right.
of things. And so just keeping those things in mind. And sometimes you might need to give like specific explicit instruction to autistic people.
Mhm.
Like, don't assume they understand the subtext of what you're saying or the nonverbal side of your communication. That's a pretty big problem with autistic people. We often don't understand nonverbal communication. We often don't understand the sort of nuances of those things. So just making sure that with them, you're being very clear and concise with exactly what you want, or exactly what you want them to do, without sort of implication or unsaid communication. We often prefer you be very blunt with us and just say it to our face instead of beating around the bush. Um,
Yeah.
and you'll often find we don't beat around the bush either. And so taking that in stride as well is also very important. Just realizing that sometimes we definitely should be a lot less direct, I will say. But just recognizing that sometimes we will be very direct, and that's not meant to be insulting or rude. But it's sort of just how we communicate. That being said, you shouldn't excuse rudeness or impoliteness or improperness for autistic people just because they're autistic.
Mhm.
Like, you should just let them know, hey, maybe next time don't say it that way, and just don't escalate it, but provide correction as you normally would, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. So I will say, from a mental health standpoint, scrupulosity is one variant of OCD.
Yeah.
So that is its own thing. And yeah, people with ASD, as you said, are more likely to have OCD. The other thing is the cognitive distortion of black and white thinking
Yes.
is
Yeah,
something.
that's very common in autism.
Well, it's so all of the cognitive distortions are things that human beings naturally fall into, and the it's good to be aware of these patterns that people fall into, including black and white thinking, all or nothing thinking, and can cause all kinds of problems. We have been going for almost 2 hours, and I could keep on going, but yeah, I know I have to respect your time.
Yeah, no, I'm good.
Was there anything you wanted to talk about? Was there anything you wanted to ask about? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think we did a pretty thorough job covering it. I will say, if you go to my podcast expecting a very light take on things, you probably won't find that with the podcast. We tend to, I tend to be quite critical of specific versions of Christianity that you find in the English speaking West. You probably, as an Orthodox person, you won't really find many of my critiques very, very appropriate to your tradition, because they're mostly not aimed at that. They're often sort of aimed at the dominant religious ways that you see expressed in the West, which are mostly Protestant, or if they're Catholic, they're sort of a certain version of Catholicism. And so you might not particularly relate to all the criticisms that I'm giving.
Such a person would not be watching my channel, because if
Yes.
you watched my channel, I am quite blunt with my criticism.
Yes. So yeah, I've been told that some Christians listen to my podcast and they're like, "Ooh, you really don't like some of these things, and it's like, nope, I don't, because I see them wreck people every day, and
So
that's
what
not
are
that's
what are
not
some
fun.
of those things that?
So like very specific um doctrinal expressions, for example, like um insistences that if you don't believe every like part of this doctrine, you're going to hell. A sort of like all the cupcakes need to be on the plate, and if like a crumb falls off, then you're screwed type of thing. um, we also tend to just have really bad intellectual habits in a lot of Christianity, where we tend to have a view of things where we build these like really tightly wound like watches, theological watches, like where every idea and every piece of doctrine are like very finely tuned and in these really tightly wound things, where if like one grain of sand gets into the mechanism, it breaks everything apart and blows everything up. And so that happens a lot. You get a lot of people trying to like exorcise the demon of autism out of people in like charismatic circles and like a lot of sort of the faith healing Pentecostal traditions.
Okay.
There's a lot of like heavy emphasis on the way you know you're saved is not like through assurance of baptism or the sacraments. It's through this like nebulous emotional experience that is not super well defined. And so like there's a lot of idea that you aren't truly saved unless you have this type of experience. And then a lot of autistic people are like, well, I don't know if I do have that experience. Do I have that experience? Maybe I'm not saved. And they sort of go through this like repeated negative feedback loop. Again, you typically don't find that with Orthodoxy, or really any of the high church traditions, because they put a much higher emphasis on sacrament, um, and things like that. So you get those, and then you get like just there's a lot of really unhelpful ways of thinking about Christianity that are heavily emphasized in sort of Western Christianity, like specific modes of relational thinking that autistic people just don't do very well.
Hmm.
And again, the emphasis is often on this like individual interpersonal relationship with Jesus, and autistic people conceptualize relationships very, very differently than non autistic people. And the way that we think about relationships is so radically different that we can't parse what they're saying. And so we don't understand what they're saying. And there are all these difficulties with it. There's also something I call like the universal Christian experience. It's not actually a universal autistic Christian experience, but I sort of the joking thing I call it just because it happens so often with, are you familiar with like praise and worship nights and things like that? Like, do you know what I mean when I say that? So
No.
there are these, especially in like evangelical Protestantism, you get these like praise bands and they're all playing, and it creates this like emotional sensation that sort of moves through the crowd, and they have like altar calls and it's very emotionally charged,
Right.
and people are sort of feeding off everyone else's emotions,
Right.
and they interpret that as the moving of the Holy Spirit. And
Right.
autistic people often don't feel that. Like
Right.
autistic people often aren't feeding off everyone else's emotions. We're sort of just like chilling out, like I talked about that triadic joint attention
Hmm.
issue, where we don't often feed off of the other people, and our perception of something isn't often as socially involved as other people's. That, again, that's not to say we never experience this or no one ever feels this, but it's just it's less likely in autistic people. And so there's this experience where you're at these events and people are like, I am feeling the Holy Spirit move here, or I feel really truly convicted, and you're just like, I feel nothing. Like this, I'm not moved at all. And so you really, two options come out of that, right? Either this is all fake and no one's actually feeling anything, and this is just a socio-emotional experience mediated through like some sort of combination of sociality and music and a bunch of other psychological factors, and this is all kind of just a ruse, or number two is this is real and God doesn't love me. And neither of those two options are particularly good. And so I'm often quite critical of the way that Christianity expects emotional expression in matters of salvation and matters of sort of belonging to the group. Because autistic people, we express emotions very differently. We, you'll if you talk to autistic people, we tend to be pretty stoic, pretty monotone. Well, I mean, depends on the autistic. Some of us are like extremely emotional and feel everything, and some of us are feel nothing, or don't really express it. And a lot of Christianity, I think, mistakenly places a lot of heavy emphasis. Again, Christianity, like Protestant Christianity in the West, places a lot of emphasis on these emotions and these feelings as being the core, central, important part. And I just don't think it is. And I think those ideas do a lot of harm to autistic people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have to ask you, what about speaking in tongues and
Oh
that?
yeah. So I recently just did an episode on autistic Pentecostals.
Really?
Um,
Okay.
yeah. And so I will say I mostly speak to ex-Pentecostals or autistic people who leave Pentecostalism, mostly because they don't speak in tongues. I've talked to a few who genuinely say they speak in tongues, but it's like 5%. It's an extremely small percentage of us who do relate to those sort of ecstatic emotional experiences, but the vast majority of us feel nothing. And that's why like they'll try to exorcise the demon of autism out of people,
Yeah.
because they believe that like in order to truly be saved, you need to speak in tongues. Like that is like a pillar of Pentecostal thought.
You're manifesting fruits
Yes,
of faith. Yeah.
yes. And so what happens if you can't, or if you don't, or if you say you feel nothing? Well, it must be a demon that's stopping you. So we need to exorcise this demon. And so many Pentecostal and charismatic autistic Christians will tell me stories about how they are just like desperate to feel something and to engage in this, and how they have people like repeatedly praying over them and trying to cast out a demon, and the demon isn't there. It's not a demon. It's just they're autistic and they don't feel and express emotion in that way. And emotion isn't what's important to Christianity, right? Like your feeling isn't your feelings, or your like good feelings aren't what's important. And I think we often miss that and
Yeah.
and misemphasize it. And I think that's another reason why you see so much high church drift with autistic people, is that the high church traditions typically are place a very heavy emphasis on intellect and intellectual thinking and intellectual understanding, and also don't place a very high value on sort of emotional experiences or ecstatic emotional experiences.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, it's it. So this has been for us certainly for me, but Fountain of Comfort. Part of the issue is that there are certain things which I sincerely believe psychology and mental health needs to distinguish itself from spiritual and theology, right? This is not the Bible, and it's not right. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people who go to therapists, mental health therapists, for absolution and for confession. I, as mental health professionals, we're not dealing with sin. That's the
Yep.
religious thing. Um, the way my rabbi put it is uh, a a religious plumber doesn't start a synagogue that does plumbing. A religious plumber just has a plumbing business which is permeated by their religiosity. And I have to say, like, taking that plumbing analogy maybe a little bit too far, right? Sometimes I see people trying to use spiritual things, like if your sink is stuck, like if you're exercising the demon of
Yeah.
clogged sinks, like, as a plumber, there are things you can do which will be much more effective. And so that becomes
Yeah.
a theological issue, right? And so I don't know if I can comfortably say to a Calvinist, or because honestly, I believe penal substitutionary atonement is like, it's a mental health wise, it's it's just bad. I'm sorry, right? So like, I'm passing judgment based on psychology and based on science on this religious doctrine. And I'm all for, religious freedom and all that. So if you want to pray over your clogged sink, I am not going to force
Yep.
you
Have
to
at
use
her.
a plunger, right? Or like, Drano is not, I'm not going to bring Drano over to your house and force it down your sink. At the same time, I think there's a certain place for people who want the plumbing to work the way plumbers make them, like people with snakes. Yay!
Yep. Yep.
Did I take that analogy way too far?
No, I mean, I think that's a good point, and I would largely agree with that. Like, I mean, I just think I have a very pragmatic approach to these things. I have like my approach is, if it's stupid and it works, it's not stupid. Or like, just do whatever makes sense for the situation, apply whatever tools that you think are necessary to get the job done. Not every tool is built to do the job that you need it to do. And so just do an assessment, figure out what the right tool is, and then apply that tool. Sometimes it's going to be psychological, sometimes it's going to be spiritual, sometimes it's going to be both. Just like, assess the situation, do what makes sense, and don't get too hooked on panaceas is another thing that I often tell autistic guys that I'm working with. Like, there is no such thing as a universal cure. Don't get too fixated on a panacea. Don't go looking for the silver bullet. Silver bullets don't exist. Just get
Right.
the thing that works, get the thing that makes sense, and if it stops working, stop doing it and do something else until you find something that does.
Yeah,
Yeah.
one of the ways I try to bring that out is I say better is better than worse, and worse is worse than better.
Yep.
And like, I've also heard people say, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Yep.
And not, I mean, when you have a hammer, not everything looks like a nail. It's like, and just because something worked for you doesn't mean it's going to work for other people who seem to have the same situation.
Yep.
So yeah,
Yeah.
I think we agree.
Cosign.
Yeah, I think we've gone for almost 2 hours, and
Yep.
basically agreed on everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Was there anything you wanted to end with?
Yeah, so there's something that I sort of ended my podcast with, which I think is a useful thought to have, especially when you look at autistic people. A lot of them that I see will say something like, Christianity is a religion for neurotypicals by neurotypicals. And what they typically mean by that is like, this isn't for me. These people don't understand me. They didn't have me in mind when I was doing that. And I just don't think that's the case. Like, I think there are some versions of Christianity which I would definitely say, yeah, you know what? You're right. This isn't for you. But there are lots of forms of Christianity. I mean, I think high church traditions, especially, are ones that we can fit into quite well and quite nicely. And so I would often just encourage people, before you write it off, before you think I'm autistic. A lot of times I'll meet autistic people and they'll say, "Look, I'm autistic and we're just not religious." And it's like, are you not religious, or are you just not the dominant type of religion that you're used to? Like, are you not religious, or are you not evangelical Protestant?
Okay, so now
um,
I have to ask: are
yeah,
you familiar with the work of John Vervaeke?
I am. Yeah,
So
yeah.
one of
There's
the
a lot of autistic people in his audience. I so there are certain people who I like sort of mine their followers
Mhm.
and sort of collect on those groups, and like John Vervaeke is like a gold mine for finding
So
autistic people.
So John Vervaeke was one of the people who first gave me kind of what I felt was permission to go after Martin Luther the way I do, because part of being an Orthodox Jew, it's against my religion to trespass on other people's religions. So like I take that very seriously. Um, but one of the things in his episode about Martin Luther, he talks about, and part of the reason why he goes so hard against Martin Luther and why I go so hard against Martin Luther is because he says for the atheists, especially in the West, there is a God-shaped hole. There's a particular vision of God that they don't believe in. And that vision is Martin Luther's. And so the God-shaped hole, the shape of it is okay. I don't believe in Martin Luther's God. Well, I don't believe in Martin Luther's God either, and I so much don't believe in Martin Luther's God. I don't see any reason why I have to think the word God means what Martin Luther said.
Yeah, and I think that's similar to what I'm trying to get across. But yeah,
Yeah,
cool.
yeah,
It's been great talking to you.
it
Um,
has. Yeah, I am going to end this stream. But there are links in the description to John's channel. Oh, before I forget, what's that icon you use?
oh, that's Simone Weil. She's a French philosopher from the early 20th century, and she was definitely autistic. And
Okay.
she did a lot of like Christian mysticism stuff that a lot of autistic people typically resonate with. Unfortunately, so she was Jewish and then converted to Christianity, and so she,
Interesting.
I will say, you probably won't like what I I think she's wrong about Judaism. Basically,
Okay. Yeah.
she has some thoughts about Judaism which I think are mostly her reacting to her upbringing and not actually
Yeah.
accurate reflections of what Judaism actually is. But yeah, so she's a French Christian mystic philosopher who was definitely autistic, and a lot of autistic people really resonate with her, and so I she's one of those people that brought me to Christianity.
Okay.
So it was reading Simone Weil that sort of made all the things click in
So
my
is
head.
that how you spell her name? Weil?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, yeah. So I mean, it's usually considered taboo to like retroactively diagnose dead people. However, when you look at everything she did, and we have enormous amounts of biographical information about her, we have a huge amounts of notes, we have other people's testimony of her. By every description that I found, you're like, you're describing an autistic woman.
Right.
And
Okay.
I've talked to a lot of Vey scholars, and they brought it up to me, being like, I think she's autistic. And so I'm fairly comfortable with Vey. You know, when you go back in time to like, people ask me, was Martin Luther autistic? I go, I don't know, and neither do you. Like,
Oh,
we don't have enough information to diagnose Martin Luther. Like, and the
yeah.
type of information we have isn't OCD,
Oh, see,
maybe.
yeah,
Yeah,
scrupulosity. I mean that,
yeah. Like,
and Paul, not Paul, John Vervaeke definitely thinks he was narcissistic.
yeah. And so like Sure, maybe, but like autism, I think you need an enormous amount of information, like personal biographical information about someone before you can render that. And I think we have enough for Vey, where it's pretty obvious that she's one of us. And so I just picked her because she has a large personal significance to me.
Uh-huh. Now I have to wonder about Michael Servetus, but we'll leave that. Thank you very much. Go to his channel. He's on Twitter as well, and hopefully this won't be the last time. I mean,
Yeah,
yeah.
great
Bye,
talking.
everybody.
Happy to do it again.